The ground was bare. Only dust moved across it, drifting in thin spirals, as if unsure of its own direction. At the far end of the clearing, young men stood in a loose line. Their breaths were uneven, their hands tense around the cold weight of old rifles. The morning light had not yet warmed the metal, and the metal did not comfort them. A voice called out, short, sharp. It cut through the silence like a stone skipping across still water. Feet began to move, hesitant at first, then faster, kicking up sand that hung in the air longer than their courage did. One of them paused. His fingers tightened. It was the first time he had ever held a weapon. The first time he had felt how heavy fear could be when it rested quietly in the palms. 7 days. That was all they had. 7 days to learn how to lie low when the wind shifts. 7 days to understand the difference between footsteps in training and footsteps that do not return. The desert watched. The silence held its breath. And somewhere beyond the clearing, the path they would soon walk was already waiting. The first day always begins slowly. Even when the sun is high, the air feels hesitant. Across the clearing, shadows stretch long over the sand. The volunteers gathered beneath them, waiting for instructions that arrived like distant echoes. No uniforms matched, no boots were the same. Some wore old sandals tied with string. Others stood barefoot, pressing their soles into the warm earth as if asking it for strength. The ground answered with silence. A trainer stepped forward. He did not shout. He measured his words, letting them fall one by one, the way a man drops small stones into a deep well to guess its depth. They listened because they had no choice. They listened because this was the beginning. 7 days. That number returned again and again, circling the camp like dust carried by a shifting wind. The trainer lifted an old rifle. Metal scraped softly as he opened the chamber, then closed it. The sound was thin, almost fragile, but every volunteer straightened as though the earth itself had spoken. He showed them how to hold the weapon, how to breathe with it, how to let the weight settle into the shoulder rather than the mind. Some nodded, some blinked slowly, unsure. One man swallowed hard, as if accepting a truth he could not name. The exercises were simple at first. Walk, stop, lower the body, listen to the wind, listen to footsteps, listen to the shape of fear. The volunteers moved in uneven lines, scattering dust that rose like pale smoke. Their steps left shallow marks that the wind erased almost immediately, as if the desert refused to remember beginners. By midday, sweat darkened their shirts. Arms trembled, not from recoil, but from holding positions too long. Knees ached, breaths grew thin. Still, the training continued. They learned how to fall without breaking the silence, how to watch the edge of vision where danger prefers to hide, how to keep their heads low even when their instincts begged them to look up. The rifles grew heavier as the hours passed. The sun leaned closer. Flies circled. Shadows rank. Yet no one stepped away. A break came in the late afternoon, barely enough time for a sip of warm water and a handful of grain. Most did not sit. They stood in small groups, staring at the horizon as though searching for something they had left behind. Some spoke quietly. Others said nothing. A few closed their eyes, drawing breath slowly, trying to steady the beating beneath the ribs. The trainer walked past them, his boots leaving deeper marks than theirs. He carried a notebook filled with smudged lines and sketches of drills. It was not a formal manual. It was something he built from memory, the kind of memory forged in places where silence is rarely self. When the break ended, the group returned to the clearing. The wind had picked up, pulling thin streams of sand across the surface like threads of gold. It stung their eyes, blurred their vision, and made every movement heavier. But training never paused for the wind. They practiced lying low, letting the earth take their weight. They practiced crawling slowly, pressing their elbows into the sand to move without noise. They practiced turning toward faint sounds, a shift in the grass, a tap against stone, learning to separate the natural from the unnatural. As the light dimmed, something in the air thickened. The volunteers felt it before they saw it. The desert, so open and endless during the day, now seemed to close in around them. Shadows lengthened, overlapping like silent figures watching from a distance. The trainer signaled for another drill, a simple one. But their bodies were tired, and simple things become heavy when the day grows long. A man stumbled during the run. He caught himself with both hands, sun grinding into his palms. He did not cry out. He rose quietly, dusted off his trousers, and rejoined the line without lifting his eyes. The trainer saw. He said nothing. This was the first day. The day of learning how little the body can endure when the mind is unprepared. The day of discovering which fears whisper loudly and which ones wait until nightfall. The day of realizing that 7 days is not time. It is a narrow doorway, barely wide enough for hope. As darkness settled, the volunteers gathered once more in a loose circle. Their breaths rose in faint clouds. The ground cooled beneath them, a few rubbing sore shoulders, others massaging stiff wrists. No one complained. The trainer watched them through the fading light. He knew what tomorrow would demand. He knew which drills would break their rhythm and which ones would test their silence. He closed his notebook. The desert exhaled. The shadows crept closer, and the question lingered. Night leaves slowly, as if unsure it wanted to go. When the first pale light touched the ground, the volunteers were already awake. Sleep had been thin, scattered like grains of sand slipping through open fingers. Their second day began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the other kind, the kind that waits. The trainer stood before them, his shadow long against the dim horizon. He held the rifle differently today, not to teach them its parts, but to show them what wait truly means when the world grows uncertain. They began with breath, short, measured, pressed between the ribs like something that needed permission. Beneath their feet, the sand was cool. Above their heads, the sky looked far away, almost indifferent, yet everything between felt tight, as though the air itself feared being disturbed. The first drill was movement, low steps, feet quiet, bodies close to the earth. The volunteers tried to follow the rhythm, but the rhythm kept breaking. Tired ankles, uneven strides, breaths that did not match. The trainer corrected them without raising his voice. A tap on the shoulder, a gesture, a slow shake of the head. They tried again. Dust lifted around their knees, swirling into the morning light like faint smoke. Some blinked against it. Some swallowed it. None complained. The next drill was stillness. They lay flat on the ground, faces half buried in the sand. The earth felt cold against their skin, then slowly warmed as their bodies settled. They listened, not with their ears, but with the quiet part of the mind that knows when something is approaching. The trainer walked between them. His footsteps were slow, almost deliberate. Each step pressed a new print into the sand, the edges of the mark softening as the wind touched them. "Stay low," he murmured. Not loud enough to echo, just loud enough to settle into their bones. Minutes stretched thin. Stillness became heavier than movement. One man trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of silence pressing against his neck. When the drill ended, they rose slowly, brushing sand from their faces, their elbows, their hair. Some coughed softly. Others stared at the ground as if trying to understand what it had whispered to them. By midday, the drill shifted again. Now came the part they feared, sound. The trainer placed them behind low mounds of dirt. He told them to stay low, to breathe carefully, to let instinct sharpen. Then he created noise. Not real noise, not danger, but enough to rattle the edges of their calm. A metal rod scraped against stone. A plank dropped. A crack of wood. Artificial sounds. Yet in the tense air, they felt heavy. A few volunteers flinched. One ducked too early. Another looked over his shoulder when he should have stayed still. The trainer said nothing. He only watched the way their bodies reacted, the way fear rearranged their posture. Fear is a teacher, but it is not gentle. They repeated the drill again and again. Each time the sounds seemed louder, though nothing had changed. Some began to steady. Their reactions grew slower, more controlled. They were learning to let noise pass through them rather than shatter them, but not all. One volunteer struggled. His jaw tightened whenever the sound struck. His shoulders shook. On the fourth attempt, he froze completely, unable to move or speak. The trainer knelt beside him. He did not scold. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, grounding him like a stone pressed into the sand. Sometimes silence is all a person needs to return to themselves. They continued until their shadows grew long, until the drills blurred into instinct, until the line between fear and readiness thinned into something they could not quite name. As evening approached, the trainer introduced a new lesson, a lesson that could not be practiced in full. He explained what happens when sound becomes real, when it does not come from a rod or a plank, when the air shakes differently, when the ground feels alive for a moment, when the chest tightens without warning. The volunteers listened, their faces still, some swallowed hard. Some lowered their eyes. One clenched his hands together quietly. They knew the trainer was not describing drills, he was describing the fourth day, the day they would hear something they could not rehearse, the day the desert speaks in a voice that no one forgets. The light dimmed, the wind cooled, shadows grew long enough to merge with one another. The volunteers stood in a loose formation, breathing slowly, their bodies heavy from repetition. They did not look like fighters. They looked like people caught between who they were and who the land was forcing them to become. The trainer closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something far away. When he opened them, the sky had turned the color of fading embers. He dismissed them with a gesture. They walked back to their makeshift camp, steps uneven, dust rising behind them in soft trails. No one spoke. The second day had pushed them. The third would stretch them further, and the fourth waited at the edge of the horizon, silent, heavy, unavoidable, and the question lingered. The third morning arrived without color. The sky was pale, neither bright nor dim, as if unsure how much light these young men deserved before the day began. They woke stiff, their joints heavy from the drills, their minds somewhere between fear and focus. Some rubbed sand from their eyes. Others simply sat for a moment, letting the cool air settle around them. But a quiet change had entered the camp, not in the drills, not in the trainer's voice, in them. They were starting to understand that training was not just movement, it was consequence. When the trainer called them together, they formed a loose semicircle. Dust lifted as they shuffled into place. The wind carried the faint smell of metal and sweat. It felt like the earth itself knew what they were about to learn. The drill began with distance. They were told to imagine a line, not drawn on the sand but in their minds, the line between safety and danger, between action and hesitation, between returning home and not. No one spoke. Silence became the shape of the lesson. They practiced signals, hand to the chest, hand to the ground. A glance to the left, held for a heartbeat, a tilt of the chin towards the horizon, small gestures, but each carried a weight that words could not. The trainer watched them closely, reading their movements the way others read weather. He corrected only when needed, letting them learn through repetition and rhythm. But behind the drills, another truth pressed in, one the trainer could not speak aloud, though everyone felt it. When training is this short, every mistake becomes heavier. By midday, exhaustion returned. It clung to their shoulders, slowed their steps, bent their patience. Yet the trainer pushed them gently, guiding them through drills that required not strength, but judgment. Judgment is a difficult thing to teach in 7 days. They practiced moving as a group. Some volunteers pushed too fast, others lagged behind. Lines broke, reformed, broke again. The wind erased their footprints almost immediately, as if the desert refused to record their progress. But the real strain appeared in the pauses, when they were told to stop, breathe, and observe. Observation reveals more than movement. It shows who hesitates, who loses focus, who carries doubt, and it shows who tries to conceal that doubt. One volunteer stood apart. His hands trembled slightly. He pressed them behind his back, hiding the shake as though the sand were watching him. The trainer noticed. He approached slowly, kneeling in front of the young man. No words were exchanged. Only a long breath shared between two people who understood that courage is not loud, it is barely audible. The drill resumed. They moved again, quiet, measured, close to the earth. But beneath the exercise lay a larger question, one woven into the air, into the sound of boots on sand, into every uncertain breath. Whose responsibility is this? The volunteers felt it first. The weight of expectation. The unspoken truth that they were filling gaps larger than their own shadows. Gaps left by circumstances beyond their control. Some thought of their families watching them leave without proper gear. Some thought of villages relying on them despite knowing their training was brief. Some thought of the cost, the one no one wants to name. And though no one spoke it aloud, the land of Burkina Faso felt it too. A place asking too much of those with too little time to prepare. The trainer led them to a shaded area where the sand was cooler. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen far more than he wished. He told them that mistakes beyond this clearing would not fall softly. That hesitation could ripple outward, touching lives far removed from this camp. That every step taken here in training would follow them long after the drills ended. The volunteers listened, their faces still, their eyes dark with understanding. As the light shifted, they began a new drill. One that tested their ability to move as a single body, to trust the person beside them without question. It was harder than the trainer expected, harder than they wanted to admit. Fear weakens trust, exhaustion weakens timing, uncertainty weakens the line. More than once the formation broke, a foot slipped, a shoulder shifted too soon, a breath came too late. The trainer stopped them. He let the moment stretch, let the silence deepen. Then he told them what no one wishes to hear during training. You are not just learning for yourselves. The words fell heavily, like stones dropped into a deep pool. Ripples moved through the group, slow, inevitable. They resumed the drill, trying harder, moving closer, letting their steps align even when their minds struggled to keep pace. As the afternoon thinned into dusk, they felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring. A weight too large for 7 days, too large for their bodies, too large for silence. Still they trained. The desert cooled, shadows lengthened, footprints blurred, and the question lingered. The fourth day carried a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of training, the quiet of distant eyes. Somewhere beyond the dunes, beyond the thin line of scrub and thorn, the world was watching, not closely, not with understanding, but watching all the same. The volunteers felt it without being told. A pressure in the air, like a storm that never quite arrives. A sense that their 7 days did not exist only here in dust and sweat, but also in places where the wind never reaches. Rumors drifted into the camp, the way loose sand slips beneath a door. Whispers that people far away wondered how a handful of days could prepare anyone for the path ahead. Whispers that training should be longer, deeper, safer. Whispers that these young men deserved more. The volunteers heard those murmurs, though no one spoke them aloud. They heard them in the way the trainer paused before a drill, in the way he adjusted his stance, as if measuring not just their bodies, but the weight of expectation pressing from outside the country. A few volunteers looked toward the horizon, imagining those distant voices, the analysts, the observers, the strangers tracing their struggle on maps, people who would never feel the desert's breath on their necks, people who would never taste dust when fear rises too quickly. One man tightened the straps around his shoulders. He whispered something to himself, a quiet reminder that the world's opinions could not carry his rifle nor steady his pulse. Among the murmurs drifting across borders, one name surfaced often, Ibrahim Traoré. Spoken not in judgment here, but in acknowledgement that leadership always casts a long shadow, even over places where the sand hides footprints. The volunteers did not debate that shadow. They were too busy standing inside their own. As the trainer led them into a new drill, the desert wind shifted. It brought with it a faint echo, the imagined voices of those who study, who question, who worry from afar. But those voices felt thin compared to the heaviness of the earth beneath their feet. They practiced moving in pairs, learning to trust breathing patterns, the rise and fall of shoulders, the small gestures that replace words when sound becomes dangerous. They learned to stay close, even when uncertainty tried to push them apart. Occasionally, someone glanced toward the sky as if expecting an answer from the vast empty blue. But the sky gave none. It only watched, as indifferent as always. The world might speak, it might warn, it might doubt, but these volunteers had no such luxury. Their 7 days were not theories. They were steps taken in heat and dust. They were breaths held beneath a rising wind. They were choices made by people who could not wait for perfect solutions. As evening crept in, the sounds of training faded into long shadows. The desert cooled, stretching itself across the clearing like a great dark cloth. The volunteers stood quietly, knowing that whatever the world discussed far away, tomorrow would still arrive with the same weight, the same drills, the same thin margin between fear and readiness. They breathed once more, slowly, steadily, and the question lingered. The 5th day did not begin with drills, it began with waiting. A thin mist clung to the ground, low and restless, as if unsure whether to rise or fade. The volunteers moved through it quietly, their shapes blurred, their steps leaving shallow marks that disappeared almost instantly. The trainer gathered them in a loose circle. He spoke softly, letting each word settle the way dust settles after a long, still moment. He told them the truth they already knew. Training ends long before fear does, and the path ahead is not shaped by what they learn, but by how they carry what little they have learned. They listened without shifting. The stillness around them felt heavier than the morning air. Today's drills were different, not harder, just closer to the edge of what their bodies could understand. They practiced working as a single line, then as pairs, then as scattered points that must find one another in silence. They practiced slowing their breathing to match the rhythm of an unseen horizon. They practiced holding their ground, not with force, but with presence. The trainer showed them how to bind cloth around their hands, not for protection, but to steady themselves when the earth trembles beneath uncertainty. He showed them how to move through brush without waking the branches, how to turn their heads without disturbing the air. Small lessons, quiet lessons, yet each one carried the weight of what lay beyond this camp. One volunteer asked no questions, but his eyes revealed them. Questions about readiness, about returning home, about the cost of stepping forward. The trainer saw the doubt. He did not answer it. Some questions must remain unanswered, because answers can break more than silence. As the sun climbed, the group moved across uneven ground, shadows stretching and merging beneath their feet. Some stumbled, recovered, and kept moving. Some hesitated before narrow paths. Some breathed deeply, steadying themselves against wind that arrived without warning. They were not perfect, but perfection was never the point. Their task was simpler and heavier, to become the thin line between their villages and whatever waited beyond the trees, the dunes, the dry riverbeds. As afternoon faded, the trainer led them back to the clearing, the same place where they had trembled on the first day. Now their movements were slower, not from fatigue, but from understanding. They carried themselves as though the sand beneath them were listening. He dismissed them early, not as a reward, but because the 6th and 7th days would ask more than drills could prepare. They stood for a moment, unsure whether to leave or remain. 7 days is both a beginning and an ending, a narrow doorway between who they were and who they might need to become. Some looked toward the horizon, where faint colors slipped into the coming dusk. Some looked at their hands, dust-covered and trembling less than before. Some closed their eyes, gathering a last bit of stillness before the next day's wait arrived. The clearing dimmed, the air cooled, the desert exhaled, and the question lingered. Night returned softly, as if it had waited at the edge of the clearing for the right moment to step in. The volunteers stood in silence, their breaths rising in faint clouds, their bodies tired in ways they had no words for. 7 days had passed, not quickly, not slowly, just enough for the ground to learn their footsteps and for their hearts to understand how fragile readiness can be. They were not transformed into warriors. The desert had not reshaped them into something unbreakable. Instead, it had given them something quieter, a thin thread of resolve, stretched but not torn. In the distance, the land of Burkina Faso lay under the same dusk, its villages small and scattered like points of faint light. Those lights were the reason they stood here, shoulders tense, hands steadying the straps on their worn gear. Not for glory, not for titles, but because no one else would stand in that space between danger and home. The trainer watched them without speaking. He saw their uncertainties, their bruises, the quiet trembling beneath their calm. But he also saw the way they held their breath when the wind shifted, not in fear but in recognition. The world might speak of policy, of strategy, of leadership. Names may travel far, carried in conversations that drift across borders. Names like Ibrahim Traore, spoken in rooms untouched by dust. But here, under this fading sky, names mattered less than footsteps, less than silence, less than the steady rise of determination in young, unsteady hands. 7 days had given them only the beginning. The rest would come from whatever lived beneath their ribs, whatever kept them standing when the night pressed close. They gathered their things slowly, no rush, no ceremony, just the quiet understanding that the path ahead did not promise safety, only necessity. As they walked away from the clearing, their shadows stretched long behind them, merging with the desert's own dark lines. The ground absorbed their steps, the way it absorbs every story born on its surface. Far behind them, the training field lay empty once more. Dust drifted across it. The night settled. The silence closed its eyes. And the land of Burkina Faso waited, as it always does, for the next breath, the next step, the next dawn. The desert kept its secrets.